Welcome, folks, to this first in a series of video lessons about progressivism. I am Miss Jennifer Blank, and I will be your guide on this journey. So the date range you see in front of you, 1890s to 1917, that's a pretty standard date range. Some people will put progressivism go lasting into the 1920s, but we're going to focus on this time period right here. So first step, what exactly was it, right? What is this progressivism that we're talking about? So it has here, again, the date range here. The goal was to remedy the political and economic injustices that had resulted from America's rapid industrialization, right? So we're seeing a massive increase in the role of the federal government during this time. So this represents a significant change from what had taken place before. Prior to the progressive era, the federal government really didn't have a large role in the day-to-day lives of people. This was done at the state and local level, but federal government was very, very limited. And during this era, you see a massive increase in not only the size of the federal government, but also of the role of the federal government in regulating business and food and drugs and all kinds of stuff. And we're going to talk about all of that as we go forward. So here, I like this breakdown that I saw in a textbook. So I wanted to share this with you. This is a nice overview sort of visual. You see a lot of concept maps here of the big key ideas that you need to take away from progressive era. So if you memorize nothing else, try to memorize these things. Okay, so what are the roots of progressivism? We want to understand that. So this is a response to the evils of industrialization and also urbanization. I'll talk about that later. Populism, the social gospel movement, and there was a middle class revolution or a revolution in values among the middle classes. We have some early progressives. There were a lot of social reformers. Jane Addams with her settlement house movement is going to be really, really important. We'll talk about that over the course of these video lessons. I'll go into details about a lot of these folks later on, but this is just a big picture overview. Ida Tarbell is big. Jacob Riis, Upton Sinclair, really big guys right there. We're going to get more into detail there. So state and local governments also saw a lot of reform during this era. We had things called initiatives, referendums, and recalls, which I'll also talk about later on. Secret ballot, direct primary, direct election of senators. So it really changed the electoral process as well. And then these guys down here are our three progressive presidents. So these are the presidents you need to know about: Teddy Roosevelt, William Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. So I really pause the video, jot all this down, because it's good stuff, and we're going to talk about all of it as we go through this series of video lessons. So this is some historical context here, and the key ideas of what we're going to talk about throughout these series of lessons. But we're going to talk about historical context first, because it's important that you understand these roots of progressivism, and you can find these right here at the next slide. Here, actually, let me go to that next slide because it's a bigger version of, there we go. So here we see some of this historical context here. You have brutal working conditions, massive overcrowding, you've got child labor, which is horrific, political corruption, environmental exploitation, massive wealth inequality, and defective substandard consumer products. So all of these were key reasons that drove people to engage in progressivism and to engage in reform. And the reform really took on, reform has always been present, this need for reform. You see it when you look at the reform movements of the 1800s, women's suffrage and abolition, things like that. But this era, it took on the federal government took on a much larger role in this reform movement. So it represents a significant break in time, as I said previously. So just take a look at all these. And you pause the video. You can read, I don't need to read it to you, but pause the video and jot down what you think here are most important. And my guys will talk about this in more detail in class. Okay, so what was it? Effectively, it was this. So a variety of responses to the economic and social problems rapid industrialization introduced to America, right? It started out as a social movement, kind of changed into a political movement. Now, here's the interesting thing. Some textbooks will argue that the progressivism was not a movement because it wasn't like a party. It didn't have a unified agenda. You had a lot of different people feeding into progressivism, and some of their agendas were at odds with each other. So they weren't united. They were united in the desire for reform, but they didn't always agree on those reforms. So I'll leave it to you. Maybe that's something we can discuss in class, whether or not progressivism was in fact a movement, or was it just a sort of a series of folks coming together in an effort to create reforms. Something I want to note, the progressives, early progressives rejected the idea of social Darwinism, but later progressives are actually going to embrace it and engage in something called eugenics, which we'll talk about more when I get into details of the 1920s in a later unit. But early progressives rejected this idea. So the early progressives were much more egalitarian in that sense. Later progressives would unfortunately adopt social Darwinism, but we'll talk about that when we talk about it. So what do we have here? We have issues of industrialization, right? This is what industrialization is. And what did industrialization do? Well, it did these things. You effectively have a more efficient means of production. When you add that to higher levels of production, you get far-reaching social and economic changes, right? It fundamentally altered how we live in ways that no other event has in the past. The massive technological advancements and breakthroughs and changes in how we live and work was fundamentally different from previous eras. So that's another thing that sets this era apart. It's important to note that progressivism in history, you will see punch, counter punch. You will see like things occur and then there's a counter-cultural, counter-punch movement to that. And progressivism was a counter-punch to the excesses of industrialization. So it's important to keep that in mind. So this is what urbanization is. I've talked about this in a previous video lessons when I talked about the rise of industry, but here's the definition for review for you. Also, you need to remember monopolies and robber barons from the rise of industry. Those folks were corrupt and they took full advantage of government and used it, and in some cases, the lack of government, to enrich themselves at the expense of other people and at the expense of the country. So the progressive reaction to these robber barons and to these monopolies is a key feature of the progressive era. So we have to talk about some isms here. Okay, so socialism, I want to talk about socialism for a minute because during this period, socialism got a lot more popular. You had over 100,000 declared socialists at one point that had registered for the Socialist Party or for socialist-like parties. So what is it? It's this right down here. Advocates that the means of production, distribution, and exchange should be owned or regulated by the community as a whole, not by private business. And here you can go ahead and pause the video and read this to yourself. This is a little bit of a breakdown distinguishing between socialism, anarchism, and communism. All of these isms you will see pop up in the progressive era. Some of the reformers come from these isms, but many progressives actually rejected these and said these were extreme versions of reform. And if we don't enact some moderate reforms, these extreme isms are going to rule the day. So progressives were not generally members of these isms, but some were. Okay, so early progressives were fighting against all of these things here, right? Or fighting about these things: crime, illiteracy, alcohol abuse, child labor, and health and safety of Americans. So here, again, from the textbook. So sometimes the textbooks can be useful. You know, we don't want to completely throw them out, but reading them word for word isn't exactly a good time, right? So let's pull what we need from it and then move on with life. So you need to know what muckrackers are. I'm telling you right now, this is going to show up on tests. Whatever test you're taking, muckrackers are going to show up on it. So remember that. A real well-known muckracker was Ida Tarbell, and she went after Standard Oil, and she's largely responsible for the actions that were taken when Standard Oil was taken to court in 1911 and forced to break up. So Upton Sinclair is also really important, wrote a book called The Jungle, which really brought into popular imagination the problems of the meatpacking industry, not only for the consumption of meat, but also for the workers that had to endure what they had to endure. You need to know about Jane Addams and her settlement houses. That's really, really key. Really important. You got to know about those guys. Okay, so generally, let's go into the ideas. What were the ideas of the progressives? So middle class society could not avoid the problems and excesses of the Industrial Revolution. Therefore, they had to get involved, okay? They had to get involved in helping others and enacting reforms that are going to protect the working classes, because these problems that were endemic in lower class society were going to spread. And in an effort to save all of society, we've got to enact reforms. They did, again, like I said, early progressives hated social Darwinism, and they resisted ideas that discouraged social change because they were all about reform and social change. So there was an emphasis on all of these things with progressivism. This notion, and it kind of like goes back to the Enlightenment a little bit, where we're using experts, industry experts, and scientific evidence, the scientific method, scientific management to figure out how to solve society's problems. So there was a lot of emphasis on academic study and achievement. This idea of the transatlantic world that even though folks are across the Atlantic Ocean, we're still connected to them. And in fact, both sides of the Atlantic exchanged and shared ideas. Some certain things happened first in England, for example, and then spread to the U.S., and sometimes it was vice versa. So there was definitely this idea of a larger world at play. Okay, so Teddy Roosevelt, he's one of those progressive presidents I mentioned. We're going to talk about him in much more detail in a later video lesson, but here's a big picture idea of him, or one of those, I'm sorry, a particular aspect. He did not like the muckrackers, even though the muckrackers were responsible for a lot of these reform movements and for a lot of these, or this push to reform, sort of showcasing all the problems in ways that your average American could grasp and understand and get behind. But Teddy Roosevelt didn't like it. He thought this focused made people negative. You know, you're being too negative. Let's talk about the positives. And he thought it was too negative. So he wasn't a fan of the muckrakers. But muckrakers are these guys here. Yellow journalism is this idea that you're going to find scandals. You're going to find you're going to uncover all aspects of American life, even the deviant and seedy parts, and you're going to look at all of it and bring it into the light of day. So that was effectively what yellow journalism was all about. So again, a lot of books will say it's not a unified movement, but you do have 4 different categories of progressives, right? So the social progressives, the moral progressives, the economic progressives, and the political progressives. So let's talk about each of those for a couple minutes. So core beliefs of progressive ideology are all 4 of these things. So all 4 of those groups shared these ideas that government should be more accountable to its citizens. Government should curb the power and influence of wealthy interests. Government should be given expanded powers so that it could become more active in improving the lives of its citizens. Government should become more efficient and less corrupt so that they could actually handle this expanded role, right? So these are core beliefs of progressives, of all of them. So what is a political ideology? Why am I bringing this up? Like, what the hell does this have to do with what we're doing? Okay, so political ideology is a set of beliefs about the nature of society and the proper role of government. So depending on whether you were conservative or liberal is going to determine how progressive you were and in what ways were you a progressive, because there were 2 types of progressives. There were conservative progressives, there were liberal progressives. Each political party at this time had a progressive wing within it. So, and depending on what their ideology was, that would dictate the nature of the reforms that they were advocating for. So that's why I wanted just to note, like, this is what political ideology is, and it definitely directed a lot of these reform efforts. So what's a conservative? What's a liberal? That's right there. You can take a look at that for yourself. This is if you have taken government at all, this is it should be a review from government. So conservative want to reform in certain areas, but not complete control. Liberals really wanted to reform just about everything about the national government, right? Massively enlarged role, but not total control. But over here, a massive increase in the role of federal government. They were both reform-minded. Conservatives focused on more economic and political progressivism, whereas liberals were focused on all of them. So again, that was a previous slide. Just want to remind you about Teddy Roosevelt, a key progressive president. Woodrow Wilson was another progressive president. He would follow 2 presidents after. He was president during World War I. He was an academic. He was a professor and then eventually a governor. And then he won the nomination to run for president. He campaigned on this idea of new freedom. This was contrasted with Roosevelt's new nationalism. He contrasted it and called it slavery, and new freedom was political and economic liberty. He said the federal government didn't need more power. Current powers needed to be used effectively. So Democrats were more conservative at this time. So you have to make a note of that. You can't think of the political parties as being the same thing throughout all of American history. Back at this point, the Democrats are still the conservatives. Republicans are still the more liberal. So keep that in mind. Okay, that is the end of part 1. I hope you learned what you needed to, and I will see you in the next video.